Two young black women are pulled over at a checkpoint, but this isn't routine. It's a trap for humiliation by racist police officers. The situation spirals into an appalling display of abuse, with the officers oblivious to one critical detail. Their father, a highly trained ex-military operative, is in the car right behind them, silently witnessing everything. He bides his time, calculating his move, and when he finally acts, justice will be served in a way they never saw coming. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. A calm drive turns into a nightmare. The hum of the highway filled the air as sisters Amara and Layla Johnson cruised along the interstate on a warm summer evening. Amara, the older of the two at 24, was behind the wheel, her hands steady on the steering wheel. Her sister Layla, 21, sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone and occasionally bursting into laughter at a meme she'd found. "You have to see this one," Layla said, turning her phone toward Amara. "Text it to me," Amara replied with a smile, keeping her eyes on the road. "You know I can't look while I'm driving." The two were returning home after a weekend road trip visiting their aunt. It had been a peaceful journey filled with bonding, singing along to playlists and long conversations. The world outside was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the rolling hills. As they approached a highway checkpoint, the sisters barely gave it a second thought. Checkpoints weren't uncommon in this area, and they were used to seeing them during their travels. Amara slowed the car as the line of vehicles inched forward. "Routine stop," Amara said, glancing at her sister. "Nothing to worry about." But as they neared the checkpoint, the atmosphere shifted. Two officers standing under a large sign that read, "Stop Police Checkpoint," seemed to focus their attention on Amara's car. Both were white men, their postures rigid and their expressions unreadable. One of them, a burly officer with a shaved head and dark sunglasses, motioned for Amara to pull over to the side. "That's weird," Layla muttered. "They're not stopping everyone." Amara pulled over, her brow furrowing. "Let's just stay calm and cooperative. We'll be out of here in no time." As the sisters came to a stop, the officers approached their car. The shaved-headed officer, whose name tag read Officer Daniels, stood at Amara's window, while his partner, a wiry man with a permanent scowl, named Officer McAllister, lingered near the rear of the car, his hand resting on his holster. "License and registration," Daniels said curtly, not bothering with pleasantries. Amara nodded, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She reached into her bag, retrieved her license and handed it over along with the car's registration. "Here you go, officer." Daniels barely glanced at the documents before turning his gaze back to Amara. "Where are you coming from?" "We're coming back from visiting family," Amara replied, her voice steady. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Where exactly?" Amara hesitated, taken aback by the officer's sharp tone. "From our aunt's house. She lives about 3 hours from here." Layla shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Is there a problem, officer?" Daniels ignored her question and instead shone his flashlight into the car, even though the evening light made it unnecessary. "What's in the trunk?" Amara frowned. "Just luggage." "Is something wrong?" "Pop the trunk," Daniels demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Amara exchanged a glance with Layla before complying. She pressed the button to release the trunk, and McAllister moved to inspect its contents. From the rearview mirror, the sisters watched as he rummaged through their neatly packed suitcases, his movements rough and invasive. "Hey!" Layla protested, leaning out of her seat. "You can't just go through our stuff like that." Daniel's hand shot up, his palm facing Layla. "Sit back and stay quiet," he barked, "unless you want to make this worse for yourselves." Amara placed a calming hand on her sister's arm. "Layla, let's not escalate this." Layla sank back into her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, but the fire in her eyes remained. "This is harassment," she muttered under her breath. Meanwhile, in the car directly behind them, Robert Johnson, the sisters' father, watched the scene unfold with mounting anger. A retired Marine and current community leader, Robert had taught his daughters to handle situations like this with calm and respect, but seeing them subjected to such blatant abuse tested every ounce of his restraint. He had been trailing his daughters on their journey home, a precautionary habit that gave him peace of mind during their travels. Now his military training kicked in as he assessed the situation, noting every detail: the officers' aggression, their unnecessary search, and the growing crowd of onlookers. Robert tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. "Not yet," he muttered to himself. "Wait for the right moment." Back at the car, McAllister returned from the trunk, his expression smug. "Nothing suspicious," he reported to Daniels, who nodded but didn't step back from Amara's window. "Step out of the car," Daniels ordered, his tone cold. "What?" Amara asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "Why?" "Step out of the car," Daniels repeated, his hand now resting on his belt. "Both of you." Amara hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes as she glanced at Layla. "We haven't done anything wrong." "Now!" Daniels barked, his voice booming. As the sisters reluctantly stepped out of the car, Robert opened his own car door and stepped onto the pavement, his imposing figure silhouetted against the setting sun. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with determination. The officers didn't notice him yet, their attention focused entirely on the sisters. But Robert was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to intervene. He wasn't just their father, he was their protector, and he wasn't going to let this injustice go unanswered. An unfolding injustice. As Amara and Layla stepped out of their car, the tension in the air became palpable. The once routine checkpoint had turned into a spectacle, with the officers standing tall, their postures dripping with authority and intimidation. Amara kept her hands visible, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her breathing. Layla, however, couldn't hide her anger, her clenched fists and fiery glare making her feelings clear. "What's the meaning of this?" Amara asked, her voice firm but respectful. "Standard procedure," Daniels replied dismissively. "We're ensuring there's no contraband or illegal activity." "That doesn't explain why you're treating us like criminals," Layla shot back, her frustration breaking through. Daniels turned to her, his smirk condescending. "You've got a smart mouth, don't you? Maybe you should let your sister do the talking." Layla opened her mouth to retort, but Amara grabbed her arm, giving her a subtle shake of the head. "Let's just cooperate," she whispered. Meanwhile, Robert Johnson stood a few feet behind his car, his presence unnoticed by the officers, but not by the growing crowd of onlookers. His military training had taught him the importance of timing and strategy, and now every instinct told him to wait. He needed to see just how far these officers would go. Daniels gestured for McAllister to conduct a pat-down search, and McAllister stepped forward, his demeanor smug. "Hands on the hood," he ordered. "What?" Layla exclaimed, taking a step back. "You can't be serious." "Now!" McAllister barked, his hand moving toward his holster. Amara pulled her sister closer, trying to shield her from the escalating aggression. "Fine," she said, stepping forward and placing her hands on the hood of the car. "Let's just get this over with." As McAllister began the pat-down, his hands lingered too long and strayed too far. Amara flinched, her cheeks burning with humiliation and anger, but she said nothing. Layla, however, couldn't stay silent. "Get your hands off her," she shouted, stepping forward with clenched fists. Daniels moved quickly, blocking her path. "Back off or you'll regret it," he growled. Robert had seen enough. His daughters were being humiliated, their dignity trampled on by men who had no right to treat them this way. With measured steps, he approached the scene, his presence finally drawing the officers' attention. "Is there a problem here, officers?" Robert asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Daniels turned to face him, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "This doesn't concern you, sir. Move along." "So it concerns me when my daughters are being mistreated," Robert replied, his gaze steady and unyielding. Daniels narrowed his eyes. "Your daughters? Then maybe you should have taught them to respect authority." Robert took another step forward, his imposing figure towering over the officers. "Respect is earned, not demanded," he said evenly. "And from what I've seen, you've done nothing to deserve it." McAllister, sensing the shift in power dynamics, glanced nervously at Daniels. "Boss, maybe we should let this go." But Daniels wasn't about to back down. His pride was on the line, and he wasn't about to be undermined in front of a crowd. "I suggest you step back, sir, before you find yourself in trouble." Robert's calm exterior belied the storm brewing inside him. He placed his hands on his hips, his stance exuding quiet authority. "You might want to think carefully about your next move, officer, because right now, you're the one in trouble," Daniels scoffed. But before he could respond, a voice rang out from the crowd. "I'm recording this!" The officers turned to see multiple bystanders holding up their phones, capturing every word and action. The power dynamics had shifted, and Daniels knew it. His bravado faltered as he glanced at the growing audience, their murmurs of disapproval growing louder. Robert seized the moment. "You've made your point, officers. Now let my daughters go, or I'll make sure this footage reaches every news outlet in the country." Daniels clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Robert, the crowd, and the phones pointed at him. Finally, he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, take your daughters and go, but don't think this is over." Robert didn't respond. He turned to Amara and Layla, his expression softening. "Get in the car," he said gently. As the sisters climbed back into the car, Robert turned to the crowd. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Your presence made a difference today." The onlookers nodded and cheered, their solidarity a powerful reminder of the strength in unity. Back in the car, Amara gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "Dad." "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. Robert placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's not over yet," he said, "but we'll face it together." As they drove away from the checkpoint, the weight of the experience hung heavy in the air, but Robert knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice was just beginning, and he was ready to see it through. The calm before the storm. The drive home was eerily silent. Amara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the dark leather, while Layla sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. In the back seat, Robert's steady gaze alternated between his daughters and the road ahead. Though the physical danger had passed, the emotional scars lingered like a storm cloud. Finally, Layla broke the silence. "We can't just let this go," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. Amara glanced at her sister, her own anger bubbling beneath the surface. "What can we do, Layla? Report them? Who's going to believe us?" "I believe you," Robert said firmly from the back seat. "And so will others. But we need to be smart about this." Layla turned to face her father, her eyes blazing. "They humiliated us, Dad. They touched Amara, and they were ready to do worse. We can't let them get away with this." Robert nodded. "You're right, Layla, we won't. But we need to approach this carefully. If we act impulsively, they'll twist the narrative against us." Amara sighed, her grip on the steering wheel loosening slightly. "I hate this. I hate that we have to think strategically just to fight for what's right." Robert placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know, sweetheart, but trust me, we're going to make this right." When they arrived home, Robert led his daughters into the living room, where he pulled out his laptop and set it on the coffee table. He opened a secure folder filled with templates and forms, evidence of his meticulous approach to handling conflicts. "We need to document everything," Robert began. "Every word, every action. It's the first step in making sure the truth is heard." Amara and Layla nodded, each taking a seat on the couch. Together, they recounted every detail of the encounter, from the moment the officers pulled them over to Robert's intervention. Their voices trembled at times, but their resolve grew stronger with every word. "I recorded some of it," Amara said suddenly, pulling out her phone. "I didn't even realize I was doing it, but I hit record when they started questioning us." Robert took the phone, his expression grim as he played the video. The footage was shaky but clear enough to capture Daniel's aggressive tone and McAllister's invasive actions. The voices of the onlookers were faint but audible, their outrage adding weight to the evidence. "This is good," Robert said. "This will help." Layla leaned forward, her eyes wide. "What now? Do we send it to the media?" "Not yet," Robert replied. "First, we file an official complaint. We have to go through the proper channels to build our case. If that doesn't work, then we go public." Amara frowned. "And what if they retaliate? You saw the way Daniels looked at us. He's not going to let this go." Robert's jaw tightened. "Let him try. I've dealt with men like him before, and I know how to handle them. Layla hesitated. But what if it's not enough? What if they come after us? Robert placed a hand over hers, his gaze steady. That's why we're doing this together. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for everyone who's been through something like this. The next day, Robert accompanied his daughters to the local precinct, where they filed their complaint against Daniels and McAllister. The sergeant on duty listened politely, his expression neutral, but Robert noticed the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "We'll look into it," the sergeant said, his tone carefully measured. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." As they left the precinct, Layla muttered under her breath, "That didn't feel promising." Robert nodded grimly. "It rarely does. But we've planted the seed. Now we wait." What they didn't know was that their complaint had already sparked whispers within the department. Daniels and McAllister were well known for their aggressive tactics, but their colleagues often turned a blind eye. This time, however, the weight of Robert's reputation as a respected veteran and the growing public awareness of the incident made it impossible to ignore. Later that evening, Robert received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his instincts on high alert. "Mr. Johnson," a woman's voice said, "this is Detective Carla Morgan with Internal Affairs. I received your complaint, and I'd like to meet with you and your daughters to discuss it further." Robert's eyes narrowed. "Detective Morgan, thank you for reaching out. When and where would you like to meet?" "Tomorrow at your convenience," Morgan replied. "And Mr. Johnson, thank you for having the courage to come forward. We've been watching Daniels and McAllister for a while, but your case might be the breakthrough we need." As Robert ended the call, he turned to Amara and Layla, who were watching him anxiously. "That was Internal Affairs," he said. "They're taking this seriously." Amara's shoulders sagged with relief while Layla's eyes lit up with hope. "So this could actually lead to something?" Robert nodded. "It's a start, but we need to be prepared for what comes next. This isn't just about justice, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the family prepared for their meeting with Detective Morgan, they knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time since the incident, they felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they were ready to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The first steps toward justice. The meeting with Detective Carla Morgan took place in a small conference room at the Internal Affairs Division. The atmosphere was stark but professional, with grey walls adorned by framed certificates and commendations. Morgan herself was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, her piercing eyes framed by dark-rimmed glasses. Robert, Amara, and Layla entered the room, their presence commanding attention despite the tension in their postures. Morgan stood to greet them, her handshake firm and her expression earnest. "Thank you for coming," Morgan said, motioning for them to sit. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry for what you've been through. It's unacceptable, and it's exactly why I'm here." Robert nodded, his voice steady. "We just want accountability, Detective. My daughters didn't deserve this." Morgan opened a folder on the table, revealing a stack of documents and a flash drive. "I've reviewed the initial complaint and the video you submitted. It's compelling evidence, but we'll need more to ensure this case holds up against scrutiny. That means additional statements, corroborating witnesses, and a thorough investigation into Daniels and McAllister's conduct." Layla leaned forward, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "How is there even a question about this? The video shows everything." Morgan met her gaze, her tone gentle but firm. "I understand your frustration, Layla, but cases like this don't just rely on evidence. They rely on airtight cases that leave no room for doubt. Daniels and McAllister will deny everything, and they'll have union representatives and lawyers ready to fight back." Amara frowned, her voice trembling with anger. "So, what are we supposed to do? Just wait while they keep abusing their power?" "Not at all," Morgan replied. "That's why I'm here, to make sure they're held accountable. But it's a process, and it's going to take time. I need your trust and cooperation." Robert placed a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder. "We're ready to cooperate, Detective, whatever you need." Morgan nodded, her expression softening. "Good. Let's start with your statements. Walk me through everything from the moment you were stopped to the moment you left the scene." For the next hour, Robert and his daughters recounted the incident in painstaking detail. Morgan listened intently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't their first complaint," Morgan said finally, her voice heavy with frustration. "Daniels and McAllister have a pattern of behavior, but their previous cases have always fallen apart due to lack of evidence or unwillingness from victims to testify. Your case is different, it's stronger, but that also makes it more dangerous." Amara's eyes widened. "Dangerous how?" Morgan hesitated before answering. "Daniels has a reputation for retaliating against those who speak out against him. I'm not saying this to scare you, but to prepare you. If you proceed with this, you need to be ready for the possibility that he'll try to intimidate you." Robert's jaw tightened. "We've faced intimidation before, Detective. It won't stop us." Morgan smiled faintly. "I had a feeling you'd say that. Just know that you won't be alone in this. I'll be monitoring their movements closely, and I'll make sure you're protected." Layla, her voice trembling but resolute, asked, "What happens now?" "We launch a formal investigation," Morgan replied. "I'll interview other officers who've worked with Daniels and McAllister, review their records, and reach out to witnesses from your incident. In the meantime, I recommend you keep a low profile. If you notice anything suspicious, people watching your house following you, call me immediately." The family left the meeting with a mix of hope and trepidation. On the drive home, Amara broke the silence. "Do you think we're doing the right thing, Dad?" Robert didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. This isn't just about us. It's about stopping them from doing this to anyone else." As the days passed, the investigation gained traction. Morgan uncovered a trove of internal complaints against Daniels and McAllister, many of which had been buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape. Witnesses began coming forward, emboldened by the Johnsons' courage and the growing attention on the case. Meanwhile, Robert took extra precautions to protect his family. He installed security cameras around their home and made sure Amara and Layla never went anywhere alone. The girls resumed their routines, but the shadow of the incident lingered. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Robert's phone buzzed with a call from Morgan. "We have a problem," she said, her tone tense. "What's going on?" Robert asked, his voice sharp with concern. "Daniels and McAllister have caught wind of the investigation. They've been asking questions about your family, where you live, where the girls go to school. I've already reported it to my superiors, but I thought you should know." Robert's grip on the phone tightened. "What are you doing to stop them?" "We've assigned plainclothes officers to monitor their movements and patrol your neighborhood," Morgan assured him. "But I need you to stay vigilant. Don't take any chances." After the call ended, Robert turned to his daughters, his expression grave. "Things might get tougher before they get better, but we're going to get through this. Together." Layla nodded, her eyes fierce. "They can try to scare us, but they won't win." Amara smiled faintly, her voice steady. "We're not backing down." Robert felt a surge of pride as he looked at his daughters. Despite everything they had been through, their spirit remained unbroken. And with their strength fueling him, he knew they would see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. The breaking point. The weeks that followed were a test of endurance for the Johnson family. While Detective Morgan's investigation gained momentum, the looming threat of retaliation from Daniels and McAllister cast a constant shadow over their lives. Every ringing phone, every unfamiliar car passing their house felt like a potential danger. Robert kept his daughters close, their routines more restricted than ever. Layla and Amara understood the precautions, but the weight of being watched, both by the public and their harassers, took a toll. "Dad," Amara said one evening as they sat on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across their yard, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day?" Robert, leaning back in his chair, turned his gaze toward his daughter. "I do, and every time I think about it, I thank God I was there." Layla, sitting cross-legged on the porch steps, added quietly, "It's just hard, knowing they're still out there probably laughing about this." Robert's jaw tightened. "They won't be laughing for long. Morgan's building a case that will end their careers for good. We just have to hold on." That sense of resolve was tested the next morning when Robert received an unexpected call from Detective Morgan. Her voice, normally calm and composed, carried an edge of urgency. "Robert, we've hit a snag," she began. "Daniels and McAllister's union rep is already trying to discredit the investigation. They're claiming your daughters fabricated the incident." Robert's stomach dropped. "Fabricated? Are you kidding me? We have video evidence." "They're saying the video is incomplete," Morgan replied. "That it doesn't show what happened before the checkpoint, so there's context missing. It's a desperate move, but it's working with certain officials." Robert clenched his fists, his voice low and measured. "So what do we do?" "We keep fighting," Morgan said firmly, "but I need you to be prepared. This might go public soon, and when it does, the media could twist the story in ways we can't control." Robert exhaled slowly. "We'll be ready." Later that evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Sophia, the girl's mother and Robert's ex-wife, joined them. She had been quietly supportive since the incident, offering to help in any way she could. Tonight, her presence brought a rare sense of normalcy. "I've been thinking," Sophia said, her tone careful. "If this goes public, the girls might face backlash. Have you thought about how we'll handle that?" Robert nodded. "I've thought about nothing else, but the truth is, we can't shield them from everything. What we can do is stand together and make sure they know we're not afraid." Layla looked up from her plate, her voice quiet but firm. "We're not scared, Mom. We're angry, and we're not letting them win." Sophia smiled faintly, pride mingling with worry. "That's my girl." 2 days later, the story broke. Local news outlets ran the headline, "Racist officers accused in harassment case, video sparks investigation." The article included a brief summary of the checkpoint incident and the Johnson family's role in bringing it to light. Almost immediately, the media frenzy began. Reporters camped outside the Johnsons' home, hoping for a statement. News vans lined the street, their cameras pointed at the front door. Social media erupted with opinions, hashtags trending within hours. "Justice for Amara and Layla," or "Stop Police Abuse." "Hold them accountable." The support was overwhelming, but so was the backlash. Anonymous accounts flooded the comments with hateful messages, accusing the family of lying or exaggerating the story for attention. Some posts even questioned Robert's motives, suggesting he was using his daughters as pawns in a vendetta against law enforcement. "Here it's like they don't even see us as people," Amara said one evening, scrolling through her phone. "Just targets for their hate." Robert took the phone from her gently, setting it aside. "Don't read that garbage. It's noise, nothing more. The people who matter are the ones standing with us." Among those standing with them were activists, community leaders, and even other officers who had grown tired of the corruption in their ranks. A rally was organized outside the precinct, where Daniels and McAllister worked, drawing hundreds of supporters demanding accountability. Robert spoke at the rally, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't about one family or one incident. This is about a system that allows people like Daniels and McAllister to abuse their power without consequences. We're here to say, enough is enough." The crowd erupted into applause, their chants of "justice now" echoing through the city streets. The following week, the retaliation Robert had feared became a reality. Late one night, as the family slept, the sound of shattering glass jolted them awake. Robert grabbed his firearm from the nightstand and rushed downstairs to find a brick lying on the living room floor, surrounded by shards of broken window. Sophia, who had been staying with them to provide support, ran into the room, her face pale. "What happened?" "Stay upstairs with the girls," Robert said firmly, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'll handle this." He stepped outside, scanning the dark street for any sign of movement. The air was still, the neighborhood eerily quiet. On the front lawn, spray-painted in bold red letters, were the words, "Liars" and "Drop the case." The sight made Robert's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain composed. He called Morgan immediately, explaining what had happened. "Do you have security footage?" Morgan asked. "I installed cameras last month," Robert replied. "I'll send you the footage." "Good," Morgan said. "This is exactly the kind of intimidation we expected. Stay inside and don't engage with anyone you see outside. I'll send a patrol car to keep an eye on the house." When the footage was reviewed, the perpetrators were revealed to be Daniels and McAllister themselves. their faces partially obscured by masks, but unmistakable to those who knew them. "This is the evidence we needed," Morgan said the next day, her voice resolute. "They've crossed a line, and now we can move to have them suspended pending a formal hearing." The breaking point came during a televised press conference held by the police chief. Under mounting pressure from the public, and with undeniable evidence of Daniels and McAllister's misconduct, the chief announced their suspension. "This department does not condone or tolerate harassment or abuse of power," the chief said. "We are committed to ensuring justice is served." For the Johnson family, it was a bittersweet victory. The battle wasn't over, but they had taken a significant step toward holding the officers accountable. As the days passed, the threats subsided, replaced by a growing wave of support from people inspired by their courage. One evening, as the family sat together watching the sunset, Layla turned to her father. "Do you think this will really change anything?" Robert smiled, his voice filled with hope. "It already has, and it's just the beginning." A ripple effect. The suspension of Daniels and McAllister was a turning point, but it was far from the resolution the Johnson family needed. The fight for accountability had triggered a ripple effect that reached far beyond their own lives. For weeks, the story dominated headlines, sparking heated debates about systemic racism and police misconduct. Community leaders and activists rallied around the Johnsons, amplifying their voices and pushing for policy changes. Public officials began to weigh in, some calling for reforms, while others attempted to downplay the incident, claiming it was an isolated case. Robert found himself in a unique and challenging position. As a father, his priority was to protect his daughters. But as a man who had witnessed injustice firsthand, he felt a growing responsibility to use this platform for the greater good. Detective Morgan arranged a meeting between Robert and Police Chief Gregory Stanton. The chief, a man in his late 50s with a reputation for being tough but fair, greeted Robert with a firm handshake. "Mr. Johnson," Stanton began, his tone measured, "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for what your family has endured. What happened to your daughters is unacceptable." Robert nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not just about my daughters. This is about a system that allowed officers like Daniels and McAllister to operate unchecked." Stanton leaned back in his chair, his face betraying a hint of unease. "I won't deny that we have issues to address. That's why I've initiated a review of our department's policies and training programs. But I need your help." Robert raised an eyebrow. "My help?" "You've seen both sides of this issue," Stanton explained. "You've dealt with law enforcement as a civilian, but you've also worked closely with people in this community. Your perspective could be invaluable in shaping the changes we need to make." Robert considered the offer carefully. "I'm willing to help, but only if it leads to real, tangible change. No empty promises." Stanton nodded. "Understood." At home, Layla and Amara were adjusting to their newfound role as symbols of resilience and courage. They received letters of support from across the country, many from other young women who had experienced similar injustices. One letter stood out. It was from a girl named Jasmine in Alabama, who wrote, "Dear Layla and Amara, thank you for being brave. I've always been scared to speak up about the things I've faced, but seeing you stand tall has given me the courage to tell my story. You've made me believe that change is possible. With love, Jasmine." Reading the letter brought tears to Amara's eyes. "Dad," she said, handing it to Robert, "this is why we have to keep going." Robert hugged her tightly. "You're absolutely right." Sophia, who had become an integral part of the family's efforts, suggested organizing a community forum. "We need to create a space for people to share their stories and connect with resources," she said. The idea quickly gained traction, and within weeks the family hosted the first Voices for Justice forum at a local community center. The event drew a crowd of over 200 people, including survivors of police misconduct, activists, and even some officers who wanted to listen and learn. The next major hurdle was the public hearing for Daniels and McAllister. Held at City Hall, the hearing was a highly anticipated event, drawing media coverage and public attendance that filled every seat in the chamber. Robert and his family sat in the front row, their presence a powerful reminder of who had suffered from the officers' actions. Detective Morgan, serving as the lead investigator, presented the evidence, the checkpoint video, testimonies from witnesses, and the footage of the vandalism at the Johnsons' home. When it was Daniels' turn to speak, his tone was defiant. "I've served this city for over 15 years, he said, "and now my career is being destroyed over a misunderstanding? I acted within my authority." McAllister, in contrast, appeared nervous. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he stammered. "I was just following orders." Their defenses fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The hearing concluded with a recommendation for their termination and criminal charges, pending further review. As the family left the hearing, a reporter approached Robert. "Mr. Johnson, how do you feel about today's outcome?" Robert paused, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't just about today, it's about the future. If this hearing leads to lasting change, then it's a step in the right direction, but we won't stop here." The events of the past months had brought the Johnson family closer than ever. They had faced fear, anger, and uncertainty, but they had also discovered the strength that comes from standing together. On a quiet evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Layla asked, "Do you think things will ever really change?" Robert smiled at her, his voice steady. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like us, people who refuse to stay silent." Amara nodded, her expression determined. "Then we'll keep going." And they did. The reckoning. The case against officers Daniels and McAllister gained national attention, becoming a lightning rod for discussions about racial injustice and police accountability. Civil rights organizations and public figures rallied behind the Johnson family, turning their story into a symbol of the larger fight for systemic change. Robert, reluctant at first to take on a public role, found himself thrust into the spotlight. Interviews, panel discussions, and community events became part of his daily routine, but he approached each one with the same conviction that had carried him through the darkest moments. The criminal trial of Daniels and McAllister was set to take place in the county courthouse. Outside the courthouse on the first day, a crowd of supporters gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and end police impunity." News cameras lined the streets, capturing the charged atmosphere. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution, led by an experienced district attorney named Carla Mendez, presented a compelling case. Mendez began with the checkpoint footage, playing it for the jury. The room fell silent as the screen showed the two officers stopping Layla and Amara, their aggressive behavior unmistakable. These officers used their authority not to protect, but to intimidate and harm, Mendez said, addressing the jury. Their actions were not just illegal, they were inhumane. The defense, in contrast, struggled to justify the officers' behavior. Their arguments centered on procedural errors and misunderstandings, but these claims crumbled under cross-examination. Layla and Amara took the stand on the second day of the trial. Their testimonies were emotional but unwavering, painting a vivid picture of the trauma they had endured. "When they stopped us, I thought they would just check our IDs and let us go," Layla said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But then they started yelling, calling us names and making us feel like we didn't belong. I've never been so scared in my life." Amara, though visibly nervous, spoke with quiet determination. "I kept thinking about my dad in the car behind us. I wanted him to help, but I knew if he stepped in, they might hurt him too." Their words struck a chord with the jury, many of whom seemed visibly moved. Robert's testimony was equally powerful. "As a father, you never want to see your children in danger," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But as a black man, I knew that intervening could have made things worse. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make." The prosecution's case was bolstered by the testimony of Detective Morgan, who had led the internal investigation. Morgan provided a detailed account of the officers' misconduct, including their history of complaints and the evidence linking them to the vandalism at the Johnsons' home. What these officers did wasn't just an isolated incident, Morgan said. It was part of a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for far too long. The defense attempted to discredit Morgan, but their efforts fell flat. The jury's growing skepticism of the officers' innocence was palpable. On the fifth day of the trial, the prosecution dropped a bombshell, They presented an anonymous tip that had led to additional evidence: audio recordings of Daniels and McAllister bragging about their actions at the checkpoint. The recordings were damning. In one clip, Daniels could be heard laughing as he recounted the encounter. "Did you see their faces? They were terrified. That's how you keep people like them in line." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Even the defense attorneys seemed stunned by the revelation. For many in the room, this was the final nail in the coffin. After 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments and deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as the judge read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Officers Daniels and McAllister, guilty on all charges." A wave of relief and emotion swept through the room. Layla and Amara hugged their parents tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as news of the verdict spread. The judge sentenced Daniels and McAllister to prison terms, citing their abuse of power and the lasting harm they had caused. It was a landmark ruling, one that sent a clear message about accountability and justice. In the weeks following the trial, the Johnson family became advocates for broader police reform. They worked closely with local officials and civil rights groups to push for changes, including mandatory body cameras, anti-bias training, and stricter oversight of misconduct allegations. "Justice isn't just about one verdict," Robert said during a televised interview. "It's about creating a system where this kind of injustice can't happen again." Layla and Amara also found their voices as young activists, speaking at schools and community events about their experiences and the importance of standing up against injustice. A legacy of change. Months after the trial, the Johnson family's lives had settled into a new rhythm. While the scars of the ordeal remained, they had transformed their pain into purpose. The attention their case received sparked not just conversations, but tangible changes within their community and beyond. The local police department, once reluctant to acknowledge systemic issues, implemented sweeping reforms. Chief among them was a policy mandating body cameras for all officers on duty, ensuring transparency and accountability. Anti-bias training became a cornerstone of their operations, and a citizen oversight committee was formed to review misconduct cases. The Johnsons played a pivotal role in these changes, attending meetings, sharing their story, and holding officials accountable. "We're not just doing this for us," Robert often said. "We're doing it for everyone who didn't get justice." Layla and Amara became symbols of resilience and empowerment. They organized workshops for young people, focusing on knowing their rights and standing up against discrimination. Their voices, once silenced by fear, now resonated with strength and determination. Their story continued to inspire. Documentaries, articles, and even a feature film highlighted the events at the checkpoint, ensuring the message reached a wider audience. Celebrities and activists amplified their voices, turning their fight into a national movement for justice and equality. The family received invitations to speak at universities, conferences, and community events. Robert and his daughters stood on stages across the country, their words igniting hope and courage in those who heard them. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Robert said during one speech. "But when we stand together, when we refuse to stay silent, we can create a world where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." Back at home, the Johnsons found solace in their tight-knit family bond. Sunday dinners became a cherished tradition, filled with laughter, stories, and the occasional debate about who made the best mac and cheese. "Can you believe all this started because of a random checkpoint?" Amara said one evening, shaking her head. "It wasn't random," Robert replied, his voice firm. "It was meant to intimidate, but instead, it sparked something they never expected: change." Layla smiled. "And we're not done yet." To those who followed their journey, the Johnsons had a message. This isn't just our story, it's all of ours. Every voice matters, every action counts. Together, we can build a world where no one has to endure what we did. Their courage became a beacon for others facing injustice. Letters poured in from people across the globe, sharing their own struggles and thanking the Johnsons for their bravery. The family responded to as many as they could, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. As the Johnsons stood on their porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Robert turned to his daughters. You both showed more courage in that moment than most people do in a lifetime. I'm proud of you." Layla hugged him tightly. "We learned it from you, Dad." Amara nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "And we're going to keep fighting, for everyone." The family stood together, united by the trials they had faced and the hope they carried for a better future. To those who stayed until the end of this powerful story, thank you. Your support fuels the mission of amplifying voices that challenge injustice and inspire change. What would you have done in Robert's place? Have you ever faced a moment where standing up was the only option? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Together, we can create a community that values justice, equality, and the courage to fight for what's right. The content is fictitious and does not reflect reality or encourage negative behaviors.